Okay, everyone, if we can get started. My name is Ron Stagg, and I'll be chairing today. We have two speakers, Jennifer Dundas, who will be speaking on the issue of Henry Dundas, and Lynn McDonald, who will be speaking on the issue of, Egerton Ryerson. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the land we're meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And we'd like to recognize that, particularly since one of these issues is particularly important to Indigenous people. I want to explain that while we will be mentioning residential schools and we'll be mentioning slavery, we will not be discussing them. We recognize the odious qualities of those two things. What we are talking about here is two people who've been accused of participating in this. Egerton Ryerson for being the principal agent in creating residential schools, and Henry Dundas for being in favor of slavery and delaying its abolition. So that's what we're doing. We're going to have the two speeches, a very brief talk on what we're doing, and then we'll invite questions and comments from the audience, including those of you who are on Zoom. Now, those of you who are on Zoom, we're a little bit primitive here. There are some slides which are projected behind me. You will see there. But the issue, because of the way we're set up, the actual text will be backwards. You will, however, see the photographs, and there will be a talk about it by both of the speakers. So I think without further ado, Jennifer Dundas is going to talk first about Henry Dundas.
Hey, good evening. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and how I came to this issue. I'm a former journalist. I worked for the CBC, radio and television, as a reporter and news anchor for 20 years. I then left that field to become a lawyer and became a Crown prosecutor, which I've been doing for most of the last 17 years now. I am obviously a member of the Dundas family writ large. I'm not a direct descendant of Henry Dundas. I may be a descendant of his third cousin. People are curious about that, so I thought I'd let you know about that. So my interest in this really did come from the fact that I share the same last name, and the fact that I had many family members who were very upset to learn about these matters. And when I heard about the accusation that Henry Dundas had intentionally delayed abolition of the slave trade, I was mortified, I was horrified, and I thought, I'm going to have to change my name. Never mind Dundas Street. What am I going to do about my name? Because in all of my adult life, I have devoted myself to public service and the betterment of the disadvantaged, giving voice to them. And so finding myself now defending the legacy of a person accused of such things is not something I ever would have anticipated doing. So what I'd like to do is walk you through some of the things that shifted me, the things I discovered that convinced me that the accusations were unfair and in many ways incorrect. So I'm going to take a look at two things. First of all, just the historical facts. What are the facts and where have the mistakes occurred? And secondly, we'll take a look at the political process, which has built on and exacerbated some of the unfairness of those accusations. So it starts with the statue of Henry Dundas sitting atop a 150-foot column in the heart of Newtown, Edinburgh, which is actually quite an old town, but part of the city. It was built by the by a committee formed to honor Henry Dundas, who was also the Viscount Melville, because of his service to the Navy and the Admiralty. And he had been virtually all of his political career devoted to the well-being of the men of the Navy and the seamen who served the country. So the plaque, however, that was placed on there pays very little attention to the main things that he contributed to British political life and Scottish life. The main thing in that plaque is the statement that while Home Secretary in 1792 and First Secretary of State for War in 1796, he was instrumental in deferring the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. Slave trading by British ships was not abolished until 1807. As a result of this delay, more than 500,000 enslaved Africans crossed the Atlantic. It's that statement that, it's my position, is grossly unfair to his legacy and his position on both slavery and the need for emancipation and the enfranchisement of people who had been trafficked into British territories, and the abolition of the slave trade. There are basically 5 points in the trajectory. If I look at the arc of his career and what were the points where we ought to focus our interest, these are the ones I identified. So when he becomes elected in 1774 as an MP. The next year he becomes the Lord Advocate, which is sort of like the leading minister for Scotland, and as well as being holding a cabinet position as a Solicitor General for that part of the Union. He leads the legal team that in the lower courts had been representing Joseph Knight, who was a black slave bought by a Scottish plantation owner in Jamaica and then taken to Scotland at about the age of 13. When Joseph Knight comes of age, he, for various reasons, decides he wants his freedom. He asks for it and is denied the freedoms that he wanted, and as a result tries to run away when he's arrested and then finds himself in a legal process. So there was one decision in the courts in favor of Knight and him being entitled to the status of a free person, one decision against. So it goes to the top court that decides these kinds of civil issues in Scotland, and that's when Henry Dundas steps in. He's been a Lord Advocate for a year, and so he's basically stepping back into a kind of private practice, which he does on a pro bono basis. It's my contention that a person who was sympathetic to slave owners and slavery in general would not have done that. He was at the beginning of his career and anticipated a long career in politics and wouldn't have messed it up by putting tension in the alliances that he would need if he was in fact someone who was right-leaning and pro-slavery and wanting to preserve that system. Go into the next decade, and in reading the diaries of some of the abolitionists at the time that have been published and so on, you can see that Dundas starts developing some close friendships with some of the leading thinkers, primarily William Wilberforce. They socialized frequently together, Adam Smith, and other leading luminaries of the Scottish Enlightenment. Then we go to that middle point here. In 1791, he appoints a well-known abolitionist, John Graves Simcoe, to be the lieutenant governor in what is then Upper Canada when it's first created. He's the first lieutenant governor. And the first thing that John Graves Simcoe does is try to pass legislation abolishing slavery. In 1792, Henry Dundas enters into, for the first time, the debate in Britain, in Parliament, over abolition of the slave trade. Public sentiment and public discussion had been growing for some time, and this was in April of 1792 was when William Wilberforce and his supporters came into Parliament with a petition signed by hundreds of thousands of Britons who supported abolition. It was, however, and William Wilberforce acknowledged this, heading for a resounding defeat. He did not have the votes in Parliament that he needed to achieve a successful vote. So what Henry Dundas does is he steps in during debate and proposes that there be gradual abolition, and with and gradual abolition and gradual eradication of slavery. So abolition generally refers to the slave trade, emancipation to slavery. And so he supported both, and he said both should be done hand in hand. And that was his proposal to Parliament. And I'll have a little bit more to say about what follows later. The next critical point is after he becomes War Secretary, Britain is embroiled in the Revolutionary Wars with France. In 1796, the British government has embarked on some peace talks with France and is hopeful of a successful conclusion. And at that time, William Wilberforce again comes forward with another motion, which he did pretty much every year through the 1790s, seeking immediate abolition. And Henry Dundas says, please don't have this vote. Please defer it. This is a sensitive time. You know, you're going to mess things up for us, basically. If you do this, you're going to alienate the British colonies. We're going to have a crisis in the Union at the very time when we need to show strength, was essentially his position. And so that's a critical point that his critics say was the time when he should have supported abolition. And we'll take another look in a bit at whether in fact he was in a position where he could have. Another surprising thing I came across was later on, so close to the year 1800, William Wilberforce writes in one of his diaries about working with Henry Dundas on a 5-year suspension of the slave trade. And they have the support of the committee in London that represented the slavers in the West Indian territories. But what happens is they're about to have this meeting where they're going to reach an agreement. Some representatives from the West Indians show up and they tear it apart, and it all falls apart. And so the thing about that is Dundas had been basically vilified by Wilberforce and other leading abolitionists for almost a decade because he hadn't supported their specific proposals for abolition, and yet here he is at the end of that decade still working with Wilberforce, trying to find a solution, trying to get something that they can get the West Indian planters on board with. And so when I see those things, that makes me think that here was a man in a position where he had many pressures on him and many interests that had to be satisfied, and yet was doing his best in his way as a moderate abolitionist, someone who worked from within and was basically devoted to the art of the possible, I would say. Actually, we'll just, here is the actual amendment that he proposed. That is the opinion of this committee that the trade carried on by British subjects for the purpose of obtaining slaves on the coast of Africa ought gradually to be abolished. And the word gradually was what Henry Dundas added. And after adding that, for the first time in its history, the British Parliament voted in favor of abolition. So he turned what was a certain defeat into a success. I see this as significant. It isn't what the abolitionist movement wanted at the time. They didn't want a gradual process, but he didn't need to do anything. What he did was he took certain defeat and he turned it into a success, a finding of a middle ground that appealed to moderate abolitionists and was a step forward from where they were. When he could have just done nothing. If he had sat back and done nothing, the motion would have gone down to defeat, and Wilberforce would have been back to square one with, what do I do next? Henry Dundas gave him something to work with. What he gave him to work with was a plan where abolition would, or the slave trade would be completely abolished by January 1st, 1800. That was 7.5 years away. In the first year, no British person or ship could engage in slave trading with foreign territories, and that was 45% of the trade. So nearly a 1/2 reduction virtually immediately. So it was a huge step forward in that first year. No one could import slaves from America. No new ships or companies could enter the trade. There would be higher fees. Conditions would have to be improved. Children would have to be educated. In other words, the conditions of engaging in the slave trade would be more onerous and more costly, thereby discouraging it to some extent. There would also have to be legislation for enforcement. The abolitionists looked at this plan and tore it apart and honed it down to 4 or 5 of these points, and then sent it off to the House of Lords with the deadline of January 1st, 1996. So they moved the deadline up by 4 years, and the House of Lords just wouldn't have any of it. They deferred it, they stalled, they ignored it, and eventually it died. So was it Henry Dundas's fault that it died? Should he have done more? When there was that opportunity, when public sentiment was so much in favor of achieving abolition. What I've put up here is a graph that comes from the American Journal of Sociology, published in 2016. And the author here, who is a University of Toronto professor, co-author, put together this graph showing the number of news articles that were published during this period of 1786 to 1806. So what you see is that big peak up in the first part of that gray area. That was exactly the time of the April 1792 vote in Parliament. And then what happens? You see this huge drop-off the next year. And why is that? Well, at the end of January of 1793, France declared war on Britain and expanded its ongoing revolutionary wars to include the nation of Britain. And so there you see, for a number of years until 1803, that there's no interest in abolition or apparent among the British public, because the country is focused on a war in which its very survival is at stake. So should Henry Dundas have been able to turn that situation around in the face of war with France and this incredible drop-off in public support? In addition, there were problems with the king, who supported the slave trade, the House of Lords, dominated by people with ties to the slave trade. And in Britain, generally, there was a great fear of revolutionary extremism. I mean, this is the time of the Great Terror in France and the use of the guillotine, and 20,000, possibly many more, French people being slaughtered by their own government. And so people saw revolution and associated it with these kinds of events. And also in the West Indies, there were black slaves who had risen up in what's now Haiti, in the former San Domingo. and in their own revolution, seized control of that territory from the French, and in the process slaughtered, raped, tortured 4,000 French residents, and then as they were marching across the territory, had the heads of babies on spikes at the front of their columns. And when stories of this sort of thing got back to Britain, it was like revolution in the West Indies, revolution in France, and it terrified them. So there was that. There was also the fear of economic devastation. For many years, the British government, previously for decades, the British government had encouraged Britons to invest in the West Indian opportunities, which depended on slavery. So there was a massive amount of investment in slavery and the slave trade, and to reverse that overnight would have caused economic devastation. People would have been forced into bankruptcy. And so there was not the public support. The public would not have tolerated that from their own government. And then in addition, as there is in every country that is looking at reforms, there are the people who are tied and invested in the way things are. And here it was the powerful West Indian lobby, who were indeed very, very powerful. So those were the obstacles that have been widely recognized by writers who are very critical of Britain's role at this time in the slave trade and slavery, and those who take a more lenient view. It's pretty much universal that these were the obstacles, and the differing views are over whether or not they could be overcome. Professor Guy Rowlands is a military historian at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And I asked him about this, and this is what he wrote to me personally. He said, "We should not underestimate the legitimate horror of not only what the French were doing domestically, but how they were succeeding in throwing their sudden massive weight around beyond their borders in order to shatter property rights, the right to religious worship, and even the right to due process and the rule of law, all in the name of a fanatical process of perfecting human beings through fear and violence." And this went all the way to the end of Napoleon's regime to a fair extent. And it was from August 1792 that this became suddenly very visible indeed. So was he right? Was Dundas right? Marika Sherwood has written articles and a book about what happened after abolition was enacted in 1807, 15 years after the 1792 great debate on abolition. And one of the things that she has documented is how almost as many people were being trafficked by British companies and ships after 1807 as there were before. In 1810, 70 to 80,000 Africans were trafficked by British vessels, but the thing was, because of the law, they were using the flags of Spain and Portugal. Vessels were being sold through sham transactions so that names could be changed, and Spanish and Portuguese papers could document the status of these ships. Sailors of various nationalities were put on each vessel, and in the event that the British should mount their ship, there would be a sailor they could put forward from Spain, from Portugal, from Holland, from somewhere, who could say that they were the captain of that ship. And then even the building of vessels continued under the pretense of being innocent merchant vessels that were then taken out of British waters and refitted in order to engage in the slave trade. So these were the types of things that Dundas had predicted would happen if abolition was pursued without the cooperation of the West Indian planters, and if done too quickly. It would go underground and it would continue, and it would then be beyond the control of the British government, and Africans would be no better off. The Duke of Gloucester, the patron of the Anti-Slavery Society, in 1825 and 1827, spoke publicly, and both times he said that in hindsight, they could see that Henry Dundas had been right. And he wrote, in the year 1795, Lord Melville, then Secretary of State, charged them with beginning at the wrong end and attacking the slave trade first. They should have begun with slavery itself, and Lord Melville was right. For slavery was the real cause, the root of the slave trade, and unhappily, and to the disgrace of this country, slavery was just as flourishing now as it was then. Another thing that influenced me was reading William Wilberforce's diaries, and I just basically did a control search on every mention he made of Dundas in his diaries, all of which, the published ones, are all online. And it does show that there's a complicated friendship here. After that April 1792 vote, 6 weeks later, William Wilberforce is dropping in at Dundas's, staying for several days before he sets off for Bath. I mean, and he just referred to this as a perfectly normal thing, that he would drop in on Henry Dundas and stay for a few days. Then there are many other references like this. And in this slide, I've made a note of some. Went home with Dundas and Pitt and stayed discussing mission business. Breakfasted with Dundas and Eliot. Dundas complying and appointing us to dinner. They're just, the diaries are replete with these kinds of casual references to being intimate social friends, or maybe you call them friendly acquaintances, but certainly they shared the intimacies of dinners, breakfasts, and sleeping in the same house. It just seems to me that a man who would do that, like for Wilberforce to treat Dundas in this way, he must have understood that the issue was more complicated than he was writing about and speaking about publicly. Okay, so I mentioned I'm a Crown prosecutor. I'll tell you, with every trial I approach, the first thing I do is I assess what is my biggest challenge. It's the hardest thing to face. You want to deal with all your strengths on your case, but where am I weak? Where is this case weak? And so that's what I did with this. And I have to say that period when Henry Dundas was War Secretary do raise some issues that are definitely worth examining closely. Because what happened was, after he became War Secretary, Britain goes on to purchase about over 13,000 slaves to serve in the West Indian regiments. Now, how much is Henry Dundas to blame for this? Well, the city would say, and did say, that he was a key architect behind this policy. And the leading anti-Dundas scholar calls Henry Dundas the great delayer of abolition, largely because of these facts. So when I actually heard about this, when Dr. Mullen published his information, I just found it hugely discouraging. I thought, how do you confront that? There is no confronting that. And so I basically gave up my work on this whole thing. I thought, okay, I gave it a good shot, but this is something I can't get over. And then people started sending me information, because I had written a fair bit about this stuff. I had been in touch with a number of scholars and asked for their help. And so some of them started sending me information. And so reluctantly, I revisited this whole thing and discovered that many of the accusations about Dundas being the key architect were wrong. 5 years earlier, William Grenville, who later goes on to become Prime Minister in 1807 and enacts abolition, authorized the purchase of slaves for military service in 1790. Dundas becomes War Secretary in 94. He was asked repeatedly by the general to authorize the purchase of slaves for the Black Regiment, and he repeatedly refused. The general goes ahead, the army puts together regiments of slaves and free black men, and when Henry Dundas learns of this, he orders them to stop. What happens is the military goes to cabinet and says, you can't let him do this, and cabinet makes the decision. And so now Dundas, as war secretary, has to eat his words, and he writes to the general again, and this time he says he authorizes the purchase of the slaves, but he said it was the king's confidential servants, i.e. cabinet, that made this decision. And then he described it as politic but unprincipled. He also, while these men were being taken into the armed forces, ordered that they be put in every respect on the same footing as the marching British infantry. He ordered that they receive the same pay and benefits as white soldiers, and also provided rudimentary education. He authorized the military to promise them grants of money or land at the end of the war, which in my view was incompatible with an expectation that they would return to slavery at the end of this. And in general, set up these black soldiers to be in a situation where their status, their education, their resources upon the cessation of their service made them, it undermined the slavery system. Because it elevated them from chattels to soldiers equal in status to white infantrymen. So there are many other related issues. So, people who are progressive or conservative, right or left-leaning, we have our groups of issues where we tend to hang together. So I took a look at some other things and what was going on with his policies in Canada in particular. I spoke of John Graves Simcoe already. But another thing that was happening was that the black loyalists who fought in the American Revolution had been promised land and resources, assistance with getting set up as thanks for their service in the Canadian colonies. And what happened was that didn't work out very well, and so he ordered the governors of those territories to respect the rights of black loyalists. It had been 20 years, though, and a lot of them had given up. They no longer wanted to stay, and so he also offered them the alternative of free passage to Sierra Leone. There was a dispute in Lower Canada about whether to use French or English in the Legislative Assembly, now the National Assembly of Quebec. Anglophone politicians represented the governing authority, and they wanted everything in English. Obviously, the French politicians wanted to be able to work in their own language, and Henry Dundas sensibly said, well, you can do both. You're going to have a bilingual assembly, essentially, is what he said. Another key thing about Indigenous peoples is that when Henry Dundas, after the American Revolution, there are a lot of people in the northern U.S. states who are still looking for land to control, and so they're crossing the border. They're border raiders. They're trying to grab land, Canadian lands, and assert American control over them. So Simcoe is fortifying defenses against this, and while this is happening, Dundas orders the governor of Canada, Carleton, to protect the lands of what he called the Indian nations, which were particularly being targeted by these marauders, and to ensure that they had such other lands as they needed to sustain a comfortable life. And he also referred to these occupied lands as their countries, which I thought showed an inherent respect for this, the sovereignty and status of these peoples. Back in Britain, he fought on many progressive issues, the enfranchisement of Irish and Scottish Catholics, returning land to descendants of Jacobite families who had participated in rebellion and had their land seized as punishment. He backed laws to liberate people who lived in a state of serfdom. And he blocked Wilberforce's plan to send Christian missionaries to India to convert and civilize the people there. And he opposed the large-scale settlement of Britons in India. He didn't see India becoming a colony of Britain. In his personal life, when his brother fathered a child out of wedlock and then died, and the mother died soon after, he and his wife brought this daughter back to Scotland to raise her with their family. And so they had a biracial child in their family, which I have always wondered about and how much that might have influenced his views on race. And his wife later abandoned him. She runs off with another man, gets married again, her marriage breaks down, but he pays her, she has nothing, she's penniless, and he pays her spousal support for the rest of his life, which was not the law of the day. He didn't have to do that. So I see I've run out of my time, and I haven't really got to the process in Toronto. And so I'm just going to quickly skip through some of this. One of the things that I wanted to bring to your attention was that I could see from looking at some documents that were given to us through someone who made a Freedom of Information request. There was a lot of internal concern about the facts around Henry Dundas and whether they had them right and whether they needed to get them right. September 2020, it's clear that the person in charge of the internal city task force says it's a losing proposition to try and sort all of this out. And her preference was to say that if we should make this about the real concern, which is that citizens are unhappy with the idea that anything in the public space could be named after someone who doesn't share their values. A far cry from accusing Henry Dundas of enslaving over 500,000 people. Later in the process, in February, she shows other doubts. Nonetheless, in the meantime, the whole internal process proceeds on the basis that these allegations are accurate. And a communications company is hired that does diversity, employment, equity, and DEI communications with employers. And it's clear from their website that they are radical. They use the word radical in their own communications. It's also clear that they were a new company and relatively inexperienced. They called themselves a startup with no roadmap and an urgent need, this urgent need referring to staff. They were understaffed. But very progressive, I would say far out on the left side of the political spectrum. So what they did was they took this committee, or this agency from Ottawa. They were an Ottawa-based agency, which was somewhat surprising because there must have been consultants in Toronto who were capable of handling this contract, of engaging in public communication over this proposal to rename the street. And the terms, one of the things I noticed was that the terms of reference in the contract for this consultant specifically refer to Henry Dundas causing more than 500,000 more black people to be enslaved in the British Empire. So you put together a consultant who has a DEI focus and a radical political agenda with facts like that, and you're going to get a recommendation that the only satisfactory outcome is to rename the street. I think that was obvious going into that process. If I can just be indulged for one more minute, one of the things that really surprised and disappointed me was that in the report, there was an accusation that Henry Dundas had subjugated Indigenous peoples. And one of the ways in which he did this was by having a road named after him follow the path of an Indigenous trail at the west end of Dundas Street. That was what was in the city manager's report. So I looked at that and I found this map, and it tells you the whole story. The Indigenous trail that they were concerned about at the west end of Dundas Street actually starts at Burlington and then goes southwest here. The Dundas Street goes from this square here at the end of Burlington Bay, at the point there, and goes straight across. There was a specific decision that they wanted a straight road for military purposes, not the one that sort of meandered and took a curve around. They wanted it fast, they wanted it efficient. And so it was several miles away from the Indigenous trail that staff said Dundas Street occupied. I just thought that was horribly incorrect and obviously incorrect. They also said it was at the west end of Dundas Street, implying that it was the west end of Dundas Street in Toronto, when in fact it was west of Hamilton and heading towards Woodstock. So that was very disappointing to see that they would take these facts and twist them when the maps so obviously show that it was blatantly incorrect. This whole idea of the subjugation of Indigenous people is just flatly wrong, in my opinion. So I'm going to leave it there. Maybe other things will come up that I have some slides on, but I'll turn it over to Lynn now. Thank you.
Okay. So as I said, we will have time later for questions and comments about each of the presentations. In the meantime, Lynn, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ron. Now, Austin is going to get my slideshow up. Okay, thank you. Well, the parallels between Henry Dundas and Egerton Ryerson, and how did Toronto get both of them so wrong, and roughly at the same time? To rename, you must demean, and we see that Henry Dundas was demeaned in Edinburgh and here, and of course Egerton Ryerson was. They were both subjected to false accusations, lots of them, petitions, social media, yet without a shred of firm evidence and all kinds of mixed information, which Jennifer has referred to in the case of Dundas. Officials jumped onto the bandwagon. In the case of Ryerson, the president of Ryerson University, Dr. Lackamy, didn't start it, but he jumped on the bandwagon and he really, really pushed it very, very hard. It happened at roughly the same time, June, July 2021, that the big decisions were made. Now here is Henry Dundas, the Scotsman who kept slavery going. Okay, so my name is McDonald, and I actually have cousins in Edinburgh, and I've seen the statue and all of that. So I have some concerns about Henry Dundas, as well as working on the Ryerson issue. Dundas, son of slaver, a monument in Edinburgh. And the implication is that he was in the slave business. Actually, we heard the man who started the petition to change the Dundas name spoke at a meeting actually on Toronto Island. And he had the impression that the Dundas family made money from slavery. I mean, it's just so far out. And then as it says in this colonialist profiteer. Well, hardly. Yet Dundas was an effective abolitionist, I would say, with three important anti-slavery achievements, one of them being with the defense of Knight in 1778, and the judge ruled that there could be no slavery in Scotland. And of course, the first motion against slavery, the gradual abolition adopted in the House of Commons with his amendment in 1799, only in the House of Commons. Of course, it didn't go through the House of Lords, and if you know anything about parliamentary procedure, you don't get an act, you don't get a law until it goes through both. And he appointed an abolitionist as his first Lieutenant Governor of Canada, John Graves Simcoe, who in fact did get slavery abolished in Ontario on a gradual basis. But it happened, and it happened faster, because of it going through gradually, because it actually began to happen. Dundas was an abolitionist. Human nature, my lord, spurns at the thought of slavery among any part of our species. And the court ruled that the dominion assumed over this Negro knight, by then in Scotland, under the law of Jamaica, being unjust, could not be supported in this country to any extent. No slavery in Scotland. That had been decided in England by a case in 1772. Slaves in Scotland were then freed. Now, moving on to Ryerson, we're going to see parallels. Here is the Ryerson statue as it was desecrated when the campaign was really stepped up. Red paint, standing for blood on his hands, and clearly making the identification that he actually killed children. We know children died at residential schools from disease and bad ventilation and so on to a great extent, and that's been very, very well documented. And but the deaths have this is an imputation of it being deliberate, of children being actually killed. I mean, blood on his hands. A supporter of Indigenous people. He lived with the Ojibwe. He was a missionary to the Ojibwe. He was named a brother and given an Ojibwe name by an Ojibwe chief. I mean, the reality is just so totally different from the accusations that are out there. These are not, just a little bit of inaccuracy. These are flagrantly different positions that are there. Go home, go back where you came from. Well, actually, Ryerson was born in Ontario. He can't go back home. His family was Dutch in origin, went to the United States, and then came up to Canada after the Revolutionary War, when his father had supported the British. So, however, here we have his statue. I'm starting with all the negatives. We're going to go on to more of the positives in due course. But here you get the Ryerson statue on Gould Street with shoes which were used in the residential schools, the beginning in Kamloops, when the 215 unmarked graves were discovered. And so people put shoes out there to represent the children who died, and they put them in front of Ryerson's statue, as if he had killed children. And of course, he had nothing to do with the residential school system, which started after he died. So, demeaning Ryerson, go back where you came from. I mean, this is just absolutely preposterous. Ryerson only supported the voluntary bilingual schools which Indigenous leaders wanted, which Indigenous parents wanted. English and Indian, as they called it. In his case, with the Mississaugas of the Credit, it was English and Ojibwe. And he himself learned Ojibwe. It took him about 8 months. He was quite good at languages. He used an interpreter for more complicated things. He supported only these voluntary schools, and he assisted in them, getting a schoolhouse built on the land. Nothing to do with those residential schools, which came much, much later. The statue of Ryerson toppled after a Toronto rally, not to be replaced, as it was reported at the time. The Mohawk warriors and eventually carted away, as you can see. But who were the Mohawk warriors? Well, Ryerson's closest ties with Indigenous people was with the Ojibwe, but he actually lived on at the Credit with John Jones, who was the brother of Peter Jones, his very close Indigenous friend. John Jones was married to a Mohawk woman from the Six Nations. So he knew Mohawk people as well. And when she died, he wrote a tribute to her. He attended the funeral and wrote a tribute to her. She was one of the early converts. So he has positive ties with Mohawks as well as with the Ojibwe. So who was Egerton Ryerson? He is known and still acknowledged, even in the Standing Strong Task Force, as the major founder of public education in Canada, as Chief Superintendent of Education. and it influenced the other provinces. It wasn't just Ontario, but certainly the provinces to the west were very much influenced by what he did there. It's hard for us to understand. We take free public schools for granted. You don't pay dues to go to an elementary school or a high school. You do pay them to go to university, but you go a very long way without paying fees. Now, that simply wasn't true. Not many children went to school at all, even among the settler children, not very many. And in the UK, fees were, there were some church schools probably with low fees, but basically the school system was geared to what you could pay. And they had the famous public schools, which were private schools for the elite, and then they went down, but they were all fee-paying. And so what Ryerson did was really quite revolutionary, that free public schools should be the norm. And he started teacher training. They were called normal schools, meaning that they would teach the norms, the right way of doing things, that they would understand, how to set up classes and do those things. He got that started, and that hadn't been done before. In the UK, the private schools that were started, that were fee-paying schools, they didn't have trained teachers. They had people who obviously had more education than other people, but they were not trained. And then he went on to establishing grammar schools, as they were called, which we would call high schools, and public libraries. He believed that people would acquire a taste for reading by being educated, and that they should be able to keep it up by having access to public libraries, which could be, some of them could go to the school libraries, but eventually a full system of public libraries has happened. Well, Ryerson, what he did further, he was the founding president of Victoria College, then at Cobourg, now part of the University of Toronto. He got it. He basically got it started, the first principal, and he has been attacked at Victoria, successfully attacked. There was a residence named after him. 2 scholarships were named after him. They went with a scandalously erroneous report by a research panel. It's a little bit embarrassing as a woman scholar to say that this research panel had 4 women so-called scholars, and the co-chairs of the Standing Strong Task Force at Ryerson that recommended the name change, they were both women too. So here we have 6 women with leading positions, and they all got it wrong. It's really not a good recommendation for educated women now, is it? False accusations by the university president and the research panel, and it was endorsed by their board of regents as the Standing Strong Task Force at Ryerson University was promptly endorsed by its board of governors, 9 of whose members were appointed by the province of Ontario. Ryerson as a journalist. He was the founding editor of the Christian Guardian, which was the Methodist magazine, but it was then the highest circulating magazine in the country. Why? Well, it covered church news and mission news and so forth, but it included international news, science, literature, all kinds of things. When is the assembly opening? Where's the governor general? Who's visiting? All kinds of things were covered there. And so it was it was a weekly magazine, and it was very well received. Ryerson published many accounts by Indigenous Methodist leaders. He has reports on missions. Well, then you look at the names of the missionaries, and you could be fooled by them because they are basically English names. But these are Indigenous people who acquired English names as they learned English, and were typically referred to by their English names. Peter Jones was Kakawakwanabe. Shawendais, became John Sunday. But you would have to look them up to find that out. But what Ryerson was doing was interpreting Indigenous culture to the white settlers through the Christian Guardian, because he was reporting their missions. This is missions by Indigenous people going out to convert the unconverted Indigenous people. Their lives had been improved by becoming Christians. Ryerson was a missionary. He wanted them to. And their lives were improved. They had fire water, alcohol, just the scourge of their lives. Methodism very much encouraged abstinence. And so you had people, they cleaned up their lives and they began to live again and made important contributions of their own. So Ryerson was a devout Christian, a Methodist minister and missionary. He started off as a circuit rider, which meant on the Yonge Street Circuit. I mean, we have a subway there now. He went up and down it by horseback, preaching at the different churches on Sundays. But then he actually was assigned as a missionary to the Mississaugas of the Credit. And when he moved there, I'm just going to spend a few minutes fleshing that part out of it because it's very interesting. But when he moved there, he actually lived in a wigwam. They didn't. He actually lived really in quite hard circumstances at the time. He loved the experience. He loved being with the Ojibwe people there. He learned it, used an interpreter also, and his close Indigenous friend Peter Jones, given that name at age 14 by his father, but who had grown up in an Indigenous home with his mother. And then Ryerson moved in with the family of the brother John Jones. So he got to know and know well and become friends with many Indigenous people. And these were friendships that lasted through life. Here is a picture of Kakawakwanabee. Sacred Feathers is the name of an excellent biography of him. And this is him decked out, may have been as he was decked out in England to show his origins in going to court. From his journal in September 1826, this is Ryerson's journal. September 16th, I have now arrived at my charge among the Indians. I feel an inexpressible joy in taking up my abode amongst them. And then he realizes he has to start to learn the language. He was happy with them. This was just a great experience for him. It's just so contrary to what got commonly believed at the old Ryerson University. The next day, this day I commenced my labors amongst my Indian brethren. My heart feels one with them, as they seem to be tenderly alive to their eternal interests. There were friendships there, very good feeling. The Mississaugas of the Credit had already converted to Christianity. He was sent there as a missionary, but he wasn't about to convert them. They had already gone through that experience. They needed instruction and they needed pastoral care. But they had already made that decision themselves. So Ryerson could spend a lot of his time, and he did, on helping them with economic development, because that's what they needed. They had lost their hunting grounds. Their fishing grounds were crowded with settlers. And so they knew they had to turn to agriculture because their traditional options simply weren't there. And their fishing grounds diminished. Ryerson worked on trying to get them exclusive access to it. He was skilled in farming. He grew up on a farm, and he'd spent some time farming, and he knew carpentry. So he was very practical in helping them in farming, in setting out their farms, in building fences, and getting a schoolhouse which doubled as a church. He could do all of those practical things. Going back to his journal, this is in December, a couple of months after he started. I have this week been trying to procure for the Indians the exclusive right of their salmon fishery. He hoped to get it. He failed. Everyone failed. It wasn't granted. Certainly he tried. He supported the efforts unsuccessfully to get land title, and eventually the Ojibwe of the Credit moved to the Six Nations near Brantford because they couldn't get title to their land. So any work that they did to clear the land, to build farms that were successful, because they were starting to do that, they were starting to get agriculture to work for them, and when they couldn't get title, what it meant was all of their work could just just be taken over by other settlers. And so they decided rather than that, they would be better off to go to the Six Nations in Brantford. They had a fair bit of land, and they were returning a favor that the Ojibwe had been helpful to them when they came north to Canada, and they gave them some land there. So, or else we would have Indigenous people living right at the Credit River, which is where Ryerson lived with them. The false attacks. Well, social media and blogs began to blame Ryerson for the Canadian residential school system. I don't know who started it. It would take a research project with people doing a lot of interviews to get it. But these accusations got out there. They weren't questioned. They circulated, and gradually they were received. Accusing organizations were subsidized by the university. The university administration never countered the accusations. Never. And indeed, they got subsidies, these different organizations, on campus. Ex-university, there was a petition signed by, thousands of people, certainly a very large number of people, to get rid of the name Ryerson. And in the meantime, call it ex-university. Anything is better than calling it Ryerson. When this demand came out, again, it wasn't countered. No one said, but he was on your side. Indigenous people who walked past his statue, who thought that he was cruel and a monster and were hurt by seeing his statue, they should have known that he exceptionally was on their side, but they didn't. And the university administration certainly did not tell them that. Well, in 2017, the Ryerson University Students' Council made a demand for the name change and removal of the statue. Then in January 2018, a community consultation report. Community consultation, just I would choke on the words. This is not research. Community consultation, anything that people say is just fine. And they released their report. It was headed by an equity vice president. If you get equity in your job title, you are entitled to blame anybody for anything because you have equity. I mean, it's just absolutely preposterous. What evidence, historical facts, they simply do not count. I didn't count it at Ryerson University. And then in July 2018, the unveiling of the plaque. The plaque was just ingenious. The accusation that Ryerson was instrumental in the design and implementation of the Indian residential school system. That's right on the plaque. The plaque was unveiled by the university president, Dr. Lackamy, with a social work student, Sarah Dennis. Prayers were said by an Indigenous elder, Joanne Dallaire, who later became co-chair of the Standing Strong Task Force. She was totally committed against Ryerson right from years before, and so she is appointed one of the co-chairs. Well, and this was for a process that was supposed to be thorough, open, and transparent, of consulting people as to what they wanted about the name. Thousands of people passed by the statue with a plaque right beside it from 2018 until the statue was actually thrown down. So for 3 years, gross misinformation was out there. People walked past it. I mean, if you had loudspeakers, well, not everybody would have heard them, but everybody walked past that statue, some of them every day. Students told the task force that they were hurt by what they had seen, that they were hurt by having to walk past the statue of someone who killed my people, is one of the expressions used. So here is the plaque unveiling with Dr. Lackamy and a student, and here is on the plaque. I've mentioned a few of the words. There are more of them. They're all pretty awful. Children in the schools were subjected to unthinkable abuse and neglect, to medical experimentation, punishment for the cultures and languages, and death. The aim of the residential school system was cultural genocide. Well, they were bad, but Ryerson had nothing to do with them. But it's implied on the plaque. Here you put it up, and it's on the plaque, and people see it, about how bad it was. And here it is. It's right next to the statue of Ryerson. So people obviously make the connection. Ryerson was not involved at all. He died before any of those residential schools were started. You know? The Ryerson Task Force, Standing Strong was its name. It was given also a Cree name, although Ryerson himself knew Ojibwe, but this was, that doesn't matter. Facts don't really matter. The co-chairs were known to be anti-Ryerson. A British history professor, Catherine Ellis, was a co-chair, but not one person on the task force was knowledgeable about Ryerson himself, not a one. And there were positive briefs about Ryerson sent in. They were ignored. Ron Stagg met with them. Other people did. We've got a couple of briefs on the task force on our own website. The task force, if you read the wording, was committed to a thorough, open, and transparent process, but it was not any of those things. Pro-Ryerson material, there was much pro-Ryerson material, but it was confined to an appendix, Appendix D. It's very long. It says all kinds of good things, but they are completely ignored when they go to the recommendations. And the anti-Ryerson statements, which came in from unidentified community members, they are the ones that are featured in the task force report. They get great big sections in the report that are there. And so these come out, they're, as I say, these very colorful inserts. There are 10 of them, and they're all negative. And as I say, not one of the positive statements that the university was sent appears in the report, and we know of a number of them. So here you can see the wording for yourself, and here is another one, and you can see these people are hurt. He's been there for many years, and now he's learned about Ryerson. Well, he hasn't learned about Ryerson. He's heard false accusations that were not countered, and the colonialization, residential schools, cultural genocide. I do not think we can honor the one without holding the other to account, and holding to account meant dropping the name and disappearing the statue. Here is Appendix B, and this is going to be a bit of an ongoing issue. What we learn. Appendix B has 109 entries of various people who supposedly, the implication is, sent them briefs or letters or communications of some sort, and they learned from them. But some of these organizations are very respectable organizations that do research and do it publicly and make their names known. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association, LEAF, Women's Legal Education Action Fund, Urban Race Relations, many Indigenous organizations, a number of university organizations. And the idea is, since the recommendations were negative, and this is what we learned, the implication is that they learned some of it from these briefs. Well, I was quite interested to see I know people in the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. What did they say? Did they recommend that the name be dropped? Well, they never sent in a brief. What about LEAF? They never sent in a brief. And members of our friends of Egerton Ryerson contacted them by email, and most of them simply didn't reply. Certainly we didn't find any that did have briefs, and so an access to information request went in. We haven't gotten a brief. And this was a process that was supposed to be thorough, open, and transparent. And in fact, it was totally secret. Implications of negativity that simply were not there. So, where do we go now? We must restore Ryerson's honor. The name has gone. Ryerson University is not going to get the name back. It's a rather banal name, Toronto Metropolitan University. Feel badly for people who have to have it, but there it is. But his reputation should be restored, his good reputation. It will take time for this to happen, and I hope that friends of Egerton Ryerson will spend some time going over this. Some things could be done immediately, but some things will take time to get people convinced that, in fact, he was wrongly accused, and that his name should indeed be honored. The province of Ontario should honor him because he was a provincial civil servant for many, many years, and got education going in Ontario, free public education, which is what we have now. In time, his statue, I suggest, should be on the grounds of Queen's Park. Won't happen soon. It will take time for that opinion to develop. His portrait should be back up inside. That would be easier to do. If you have the statue go up while there's so many hostile people around, it could be attacked again. And if you've gone by lately, the statue of John A. McDonald is boarded up so that it won't be destroyed. Restore his honor. Victoria University should repair the damage that it did. Its president just put out an absolutely shameful mismatch of statements. His name should go back on the scholarships, and he should be recognized visually somewhere there. His founding role should be acknowledged. And a major building in Toronto, I suggest, should be named after Ryerson, not Ryerson University. I think they could have in time they could have a building on the campus named after him. That would be a good idea. But I think the Toronto Reference Library would be a good one to have the name Ryerson on it, because he was instrumental in getting a free public library system. And Toronto actually has the largest per capita in terms of its lending. The New York Public Library has more books than the Toronto Public Library system, but the Toronto Public Library system is just massive in terms of the use that is made of it. So here's the Ryerson statue, where its first placement at the normal school. I don't know if you can see it well enough to see that it's a fine statue, a very fine statue. The funds for it were raised by public subscription, enormous support for him. By the time Ryerson died, very soon after his death, this was started, and support was enormous for him, and people were glad to take part in it. Money was raised, the statue was commissioned, it was put up, and it was appreciated for many, many years. And I'm going to finish leaving you with this fine portrait of Ryerson, the kind that we haven't seen enough of recently, but this is a fine portrait of him. And this is the Ryerson as we should see him and understand him and know him. So I started off with the horrible negatives, and I'm saying it's time to look to the future to restore his honor, and we have very good visuals of him as well as the horrible visuals that I showed you at the beginning. So, Ron, over to you and people for questions and answers.
Well, we have one more. We have one more brief contribution. Jan Knoll is going to just say a few words before we start questions.
Yeah. Maybe, would it be better if she sits here? Is there a mic here?
Because I was just going to mention that.
If you want to come up here, Jan.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Ron.
You want to sit here so you can use the microphone.
Thank you. This is Bill Calanchi, who's the accountant of our group. Thank you so much for giving us 5 minutes, and thank you so much to Lynn and Jennifer for bringing out some hidden truths in this time that's so full of misguided fervor. It's so important and so gratifying that you're doing that. Thank you. Our group is called Keep Dundas. We have a Gmail account, and our goal is much more modest. We're not actually trying to persuade people of the truth about Dundas, but we're trying to at least get them to say, stop, don't change the name, because historians are still vigorously debating this issue. It doesn't really makes sense right now. And for the laudable goal of combating racism and promoting equity in our city, they're much better projects for spending the $6 million than making a highly controversial change. And we have heard some indications from some councilors we've written to that even the governor and the councilors, the mayor and the councilors who supported this may be having second thoughts now. The issue hasn't, unlike the Ryerson renaming, it hasn't happened yet. So there is some chance of halting it. And I'm going to hand around the leaflet. I think some of you have already seen it. Okay. But please pass it along your row and into the back.
Those of you on Zoom obviously can't get one of the leaflets.
Anybody else see it? And so our strategy was really, Bill came up with it, about a way to appeal to people just on the basis of common sense. They can look at Wikipedia, and as this leaflet says, even there, they quite readily admit there's a huge debate about this. So why spend $6 million on changing a name about which there's no consensus among historians? So I'm going to turn it over to Bill to say a little bit about why he designed this strategy, and also a little bit about the costing and timing of perhaps sending this leaflet along Dundas Street to residents there, as the city should be doing, talking with them, but hasn't been doing.
Okay, well, basically, what we're planning to do is send a flyer to especially the businesses along Dundas Avenue in particular, because we think they might be interested in it. Because if the name change goes through, they will have to change their website address and any other forms that they have their address on. So we're hoping to send this or have this flyer delivered to all the businesses along Dundas Street. We looked at one flyer company, and it would cost about $750, we think, for the delivery, and it would have to be printed. There would probably be other costs as well, but basically just to get some, to get the business people and some other people thinking about this, and so that they don't just completely accept what is being presented in the media by the activists. So that's all we're hoping for, just to stir some debate with a flyer. Thank you.
Okay, we're now in a position where we will take questions or comments for either of the speakers. Pro and anti comments. Any questions?
Jennifer, you in one of your slides included the word civilized in brackets, and that's been kind of a contentious word associated with colonialism and so on. How do you handle that accusation? Is it, I guess it comes up with Dundas in the same way that it does Ryerson, because he uses that word a great deal in his writing. And then, you might have something to say about that.
Yes, in fact, I used it in a different sense, which was William Wilberforce, who was a very devout evangelical Christian, was also involved in evangelical works and sending missionaries to India to civilize the people of India. And it was Henry Dundas, who was at that time the head of the Board of Trade of the British India Company. He put a stop to it. His view was that's not our job, and he didn't want to turn India into a colony. It had gone very badly with the United States, and there was a revolution there, and Britain lost that war, and he didn't want to create a new situation like that, where Britain would be enforcing its control through having people there enforcing their religious standards on the local population.
There's also a use which comes up with Ryerson all the time, and that is it's basically a technical term, savagery, barbarism, and civilization. It refers to different stages that do not involve any sense of superiority. Humanity is one. It comes from the Scottish Enlightenment. William Patterson wrote about it. You get the French Turgot wrote about it. And then you get an American anthropologist, Lewis Henry Morgan, going back to it in the 19th century. But it starts in the 18th century, and it's simply that civilization represented agriculture. And Lewis Henry Morgan made the point that the first civilizations were in Mesopotamia. I mean, they weren't Europeans, they weren't white. There's absolutely no sense of racial superiority in it. So that's a different use from what Jennifer was referring to. And of course, there is the common use now. So we would want to use the term now of simply, being some kind of moral or intellectual superiority. But it was used, and you have indigenous people saying, we want to be civilized, meaning we know we can't carry on with hunting. We have to go to agriculture, and they use the term too. They're not saying anything disparaging about themselves. They're saying we have to change our way of life. We have to earn our livelihood differently. We have to move to agriculture.
The Oxford Dictionary has an additional definition for civilization. They start with the word civil, which means politeness and regard for others, which is a component to civilizing that tends to be dismissed.
Indeed, there are a number of different definitions, but I'm just saying it was quite common. As I say, indigenous leaders use the term in the simple sense of being permanent settlements instead of moving around. And for that, you need agriculture. And if you're using agriculture, then you have to be permanent because that's where your farms are. You can't be moving around.
Other questions? Yes.
Yes, I've got a question. So it seems to me I've got many questions. When I was a student at Ryerson, I tried to advocate for Egerton Ryerson statue to stay where it was, and of course the name to remain at the university. But it seems to me that the charge of being the architect of the residential school system that's labeled on Egerton Ryerson can only really be traced back to even a letter that he sent to, I'm forgetting the person who it was, but he wrote a letter in which he advocated against, obviously, many of the negative aspects of the residential school system, but talked about the fact that he wanted the indigenous people to learn agriculture, to have skills that they could use themselves, and it was all from a letter which was sent to someone in the Ontario government at the time, or the government of Upper Canada, many decades before residential schools opened. And so I'm wondering if that is the reality, and if that's really where the charge comes from. And also, is it possible that the people who really were the true architects of the residential school system were perhaps looking for someone to justify what they knew could be which could potentially be seen in the future as a bad decision, where they're looking for some sort of fall guy, and they stumbled upon this letter Ryerson sent decades prior. Is that possible, and is that where the charge comes from?
Can I just, did the people on Zoom hear that? Or would you like me to repeat? You did hear it?
Okay. This is a very important point. The letter was 1847, and it would take quite a while to explain the background for it. But many Indigenous people wanted what they called manual labor schools. They didn't want day schools, which is what they had originally had, and they had agitated for that in the 1840s. And Ryerson wasn't involved in that directly, but he was asked by George Varden in 1847 to give give his ideas. It's not a blueprint, it's a handwritten letter, and it says he doesn't want the term manual labor schools, and he certainly doesn't call them residential schools. He calls them industrial schools, but the industry is agriculture. How do you learn agriculture? You have to be on a farm. And so he says they would reside together. Obviously, they're going to reside together because they're going to be on a farm, right? That's the only way you could do it. I mean, they don't have cars and there aren't buses to take people to farms. And so he laid something out. It would also include academic subjects. In the summer, people would be very hardworking. In the winter, they do much more academic work. He lays out a program of studies. None of that ever happened. And then during the summer, the pupils there, all voluntary, certainly no compulsion whatsoever, but they would work very long hours during the harvest, but they would be paid so that when they left, they would have a nest egg that could help them get started in farming. So these ideas were really not bad ideas at all, but that letter, it stayed, I don't know, in somebody's drawer for a long, long time. It wasn't actually printed until 1898 as an appendix to an unrelated report. So if you want to go into the history of where they came from, well, the best thing is to look at the Davin report of 1879. And then it was Langevin who got the first three started in the 1880s. We know how they did get going, and Ryerson had nothing to do with any of those things. The Davin report was completely different, didn't use Ryerson at all, and what Davin did, he went down to see American reserves, and they had aggressive assimilation policies there. And so it was John A. McDonald who sent Davin to see the American ones. So it was the American ones that became the model for what actually happened in Canada. And that's a very short version of something for which there are, a whole lot of sections to it.
And that the Mississaugas had already been asking for agricultural schools.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah.
You said you had several questions. Is there anything else?
Well, I'll flare off another one. It kind of appears as though, from my perspective, that activists, I hesitate to call people activists who are, promoting the truth about these historical figures, but it seems to me that you guys, and I would consider myself to be in this, are up against a group of people that aren't actually operating in truth and reality. And a lot of this comes from the discovery, and there's even debate surrounding the discovery at Kamloops. When that was publicized, when that press release was published, obviously it started a domino effect of the statue topplings, the defacing of these statues, and Johnny McDonald statue, he said, is still boarded up. Egerton statue was toppled. In Manitoba on Canada Day, they took down the Queen Victoria statue and Queen Elizabeth II statue as well. How do people work against forces that are not even operating in reality and in fact, when it seems that the only ammunition we have is the actual historical fact, and it's not really working, it appears.
Jennifer, you want to try that?
Yes, I will. In fact, I do have a slide that's related to that. If I could have the cord, I'll put this up. It's a huge problem because, as Lynn mentioned earlier, there was, people reported that when they walked by that statue of Ryerson on campus, they experienced trauma. And so once those narratives are out there, and people are being traumatized by this, these narratives are creating trauma. So rather than addressing it and healing it and allowing people to move on, they're creating new reasons for people to feel traumatized. Which, once you've done that, how do you do it? I mean, one way would be for the people who've told these false accounts of history to admit that they made a mistake, but that's not going to happen. People have invested their reputations and political careers and so on backing such facts. They're not going to back away from that. So apologies and I'm sorry I made a mistake are not going to happen. The quote I wanted you to take a look at is from Professor Jonathan Hurd from the University of Edinburgh. He's a sociologist of history. So basically he studies how the study of history affects our society. He is, in my view, one of the people best placed to answer this question about at least what is going on. And I thought he had a very good way of describing what has happened with Henry Dundas. And he says the tortured logic of the revised plaque does not work up from the complex events and actions of his actual life. Rather, there's a view from above that Edinburgh, and probably more generally white Europeans, need to atone for their sins, and therefore he must be cast as the emblem of those sins. This would help to explain the rather cavalier approach to historical facts. The first time I read that, I thought that makes perfect sense. It helps me to understand why me putting out all this information, great citations from authoritative academic publications and primary sources, isn't having an impact. The facts are not really all that important. What is important here is the sense that white settlers, Europeans, colonizers, whatever, have to atone. And once a person is chosen to embody those problems, teasing those out and saying, it's actually kind of subtle and much more complex and nuanced, and the choices were much more limited than you realize, and these are good people trying to do good things at the time, that just bounces off because it doesn't address that real problem of the zeitgeist of the day, which is the need to hold these figures from the past accountable and have the communities that they are perceived as having benefited from them over time atone for it. So I've been thinking about this a lot, and in my view, we have to come up with a different narrative. And I think actually that's something that's some brainstorming among people who are really interested in this and want to look at this from a different perspective. Like, how do we tell a story that helps people feel that their pain is recognized, that oppression, historical oppressions are recognized and addressed, that healing can happen? How do we tell stories coming from this place where we're saying, no, you got your facts wrong. These are the facts. Because saying these are the facts is not having an impact. What, in fact, Lynn described as well is that there was an appendix at the end of this report that had all kinds of good information in it. They know this information, and they stick it in an appendix so they can say, yeah, we're aware of it, but then their findings and their decisions and their conclusions bear no relationship to those facts that they've actually acknowledged do exist. And this, to me, it reminds me so much of bad judicial decisions where a judge wants to make a decision appeal-proof. And so the judge cites all of the great arguments and facts from the other side and then ignores them in rendering a decision on a verdict and then sentencing. And it is very hard to appeal those because there hasn't really been a legal error in that the judge failed to account for certain facts. And I see the same thing here, and there's very little you can do about those kinds of judgments. And it seems like there's little we can do except keep telling the truth and kind of move our way forward, making connections and trying to be creative in the stories that we tell. So that's my thought on that.
I think there's also a factor of scapegoats. In the case of Sir John A. McDonald, who certainly bears a lot of responsibility for all kinds of harm to Indigenous people, but these were decisions that nobody opposed. He represented what the vast mass of settlers wanted. Settlers were 99% of the population. Indigenous people were down to under 1% of the population. And he was doing what everybody wanted. Nobody voted against him. And I think this is, so Ryerson has become a scapegoat. And that's, I don't want to say, well, it wasn't Ryerson, it was Sir John A. McDonald. You see the problem, but I think we do have to keep telling the truth. I think we're not going to change the minds of the current administration at TMU, but that president will be gone. There will be people who will be open to an idea that they got it wrong. Let's have another look. I think many things can happen. So I think we would welcome your participation, Harrison. Absolutely. We want to get to ex-Ryerson people who don't want this to be the end of it, and to restore his honor. And people like, for example, his having an Indigenous name, Jehawk. It should be, I say, the quad should be called the Jehawk Commons. We should feature his Indigenous links as opposed to ignoring them, but bring out information like that, well, which would demonstrate that he really did have those links. So we have to change the narrative. Not easy at all, but some of us are very committed to doing it. We have a group of people who are committed, and we're going to keep at it.
We have two questions. John, I'll get to you in a minute. You had your hand up first.
Yeah, well, we're friends, right? I don't want you to think I'm attacking you. But I do have a friend who asked me to read something. She did her thesis on her degree at New York University on Egerton Ryerson. And there's a quote here that she sent. It is a fact, this is referring to that letter you mentioned in 1847. It is a fact established by numerous experiments that the North American Indian cannot be civilized or preserved in a state of civilization. I'm sure you've heard this, including habits of industry and sobriety, except in connection with, if not by influence of, not only religious instruction and sentiment, but of religious feelings. Even in ordinary civilized life, the mass of the laboring classes are controlled by their feelings as almost the whole of the only rule of action in proportion to the absence or partial character of their intellectual development. The theory of a certain kind of educational philosophy is falsified in respect to the Indian. With him, nothing can be done to improve and elevate his character and condition without the aid of religious feeling. Now, you can take it for what it's worth, but that's something that he apparently said in this letter. Mm-hmm. So, it kind of hits to a chord of, you can appreciate why people would be sensitive to that. And further, there was all kinds of other things about creating segregated schools for black children, keeping children with disabilities outside of the regular schools, in closed workshops, those kind of things. Prison-like models for schools for poor children. In other words, he segregated different groups of children.
Oh, come off.
That's another accusation that they make.
It's another.
I'm sorry to get up at the end, but that's.
But these are false accusations. Yeah. The segregated school one. I mean, it's long and complicated. He had absolutely nothing to do with recommending segregated schools. In fact, it's part of his faith, and he talks about it that his Methodism, his Christianity, is central to civil and religious liberty, and that is that. God made us all. We are all children of God. We are all equal. Therefore, there is no hierarchy of title or rank or nation. He simply did not believe that. And segregated schools existed in Ontario long before Ryerson was around, and he couldn't stop them. But they continued to exist for long after. They were part of and this has been well written up. Harry Arthurs has a very good article on this in the Bar Review, and it's The prejudices were there, and Ryerson could not reverse them, but he certainly didn't start it. And as for the people with disabilities, schools for the visually impaired and the hearing impaired didn't exist in Ontario at that time. And only the first ones were started in scattered places, and he was asked to do a report on them. The idea of having integrated schools for the visually and hearing impaired in the regular school system, there really wasn't a regular school system. That was still being built. And the first schools were in fact, they were residential schools for the blind, and but they were only for the blind. These were experiments, like there was one in the U.S. I mean, it's just to say nonsense that he should have managed to have an integrated school system with people with visual or hearing disabilities in them. This became the law in Ontario, I think it's in 2009, to think that it could have happened in 1846 is just ridiculous.
John, can you unmute?
Yes, can the audience hear me, Ron?
I don't know. Yes, they can. Yeah.
Okay, I don't know if you can see me, but I have someone, I think, just following on what Lynn said, some interesting news that may be positive, but then I also have a question I'd like to ask Lynn. I'm a member of the Ryerson Rams hockey alumni. There's about 300 or 400 former players that are members of the Rams alumni. We're the biggest athletic alumni association in the school. And during the past year, Frank Sheffield, who's a former president, former captain, and myself, we have been circulating the information from the French group to the alumni players. We have a newsletter and all that sort of stuff. And Lynn, the information that you have been writing and Ron has been writing, I have written a very good report myself, has gotten through to a lot of the players in a very significant way. We had been having at the first of the season, the opening game of the season, an alumni day where we'd come and have a family skate. We'd have 50, 60 players come. We'd have an alumni game, sometimes enough for 3 teams. I used to coach the team. This year, when they had it 2 weeks ago, we didn't have enough people want to come to play, which is very telling. Another factor which is now of great concern to the athletic department of Ryerson is that the alumni have been raising up to $30,000 a year in supplemental support for the hockey team. And the team needs this. The price of sticks today are prohibitive for the budget that they have. But what has happened is that the people have stopped sending in their donations this year. It's of great concern to the Ryerson Athletic Department. They want to have a meeting with us. They tell us we should not be ashamed to come to the games and wear our Ryerson outfits. But that's not going to happen. And we're also thinking of breaking off and just forming our own little Ryerson Rams Association. So the word is getting in, and thanks to the Friends Group, it's been a very, very positive response from the players. So the word is getting around. Lynn, the question I have is, I think it's very important, is this concerns the meeting that you had with Michael Forbes, the executive director to Lashemi, and 2 other individuals concerning inaccuracies. I'm reading from the minutes here regarding inaccuracies in the tax force report and subject inclusion. And you mentioned, well, everyone agreed that ER was unfairly accused. The decision to rename the university had been accepted. Can you tell me more about that? That's really a smoking gun in my mind. This is the administration admitting. Is this correct?
I'm not following your question, actually. I did have a meeting with them. I was trying to get access to the briefs sent to the task force, and this is one of the scandals that I was told that the briefs would be made available. They would be in the archives in due course, redacted, to take out all identifying information. of individuals' names or organization names. Absolutely preposterous. So that I went the route of access to information, and I just recently received a report listing all 109, and each of them saying that privacy and economic concerns meant that the information not be released. Now, can you imagine? The Canadian Civil Liberties Association is not in favor of censorship, but they're down for that. So that's what that meeting was mainly about, was getting access to the briefs, the meeting with Michael Forbes.
But the minutes say that everyone agreed, and that would include yourself, Michael Forbes, and the people at that meeting, that this is in the president's office, that ER was unfairly accused.
Yes, yes, absolutely. There were 3 officials, Michael Forbes, executive assistant to the president, and 2 other people, and they did agree to that. They said that during that meeting. Yes, I was surprised, but they did say that. Look, the task force report is really a fraud, and when you look at that, and you look at that Appendix B, where they say what we learned, like we learned this from the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, this from the Council, Native Council Fire, we learned this from LEAF, we learned this from the Urban Race Relations, and they didn't. We can't see those briefs. And there were a couple of people sent in briefs that were actually negative briefs, and that is the MPP for the area and the City Council for the area. And they sent me their briefs. Because of course they're public people, but they're now down on the list as privacy concerns. I mean, it's absolute nonsense. They're hiding. They are absolutely hiding on this. How we're going to get around it? If anyone is interested in access to information, it's not something I've ever done before. But you don't have to be a lawyer. But it's the request went in, and all 109 items are denied.
Okay, can I add, so I just want to make this clear, that the president's office knew that he had been
Yes.
falsely accused.
Those individuals admitted it in a private meeting, not recorded. Those were my notes. Those are my notes. The
other thing is, Lynn, what I have done is I have filed I did my own review, which I found exactly the same thing that the Friends Group reported. I have filed that in the Ryerson archives directly under my own name.
Okay, good. Well,
Okay, thank you very much.
to be continued.
Okay, any other questions? If not, I have one for you. Now, the Mississauga City Council decided to keep the name, and Toronto didn't, which seems kind of weird. So you're going to go from whatever road into Dundas. Do you have any thoughts on why the two?
Yes, our committee actually did a fair amount of work in the background with Mississauga city councilors and provided them with reports and scholarly articles and so on. It actually ended up that the thing what we heard back was that the thing that affected the Mississauga councilors the most was that Henry Dundas was trying to chart some kind of compromise that would create a solution with a deadline. So gradual abolition in other parts of the world, some of the states were talking about it, meant endless delay. But Henry Dundas's plan was real and achievable within a reasonable period of time. And what we heard is, like, we do that all the time. We talk to people on the other side of the floor who hold the opposite view. We all want something, but we all have to give a little. We all have to compromise, and that's what they saw him doing. They just saw him doing his job and taking steps forward. So in the end, the vast majority voted to keep the name and not spend the $2 million. We haven't had the same success with the Toronto City Councillors because I think in part this is where it started. And there was this public sentiment behind it was so passionate in the beginning, and immediately in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, public feeling around the world was so intense around this, and people felt that something had to be done, and this was something that was achievable, was tangible. We could see a difference in our cityscape. So it hasn't worked as well in Toronto, but I do think we are still making some progress. The mayor made a comment at the end of the last meeting of the executive committee, which I have here, and it's a short one, but I'll play for you what he said after hearing presentations and receiving written submissions, including 8 scholars, 7 of whom said the city was making a mistake and was basing it on the wrong set of facts, and then a number of people from our committee, Jan's committee, and other independent people. And here's what he said. Oh.
Looks like you're at the end rather than the beginning.
Is that it?
Just address the, what the deputy mayor referred to as the shameful disregard of the evidence. And I think he was quoting some of the deputies, and I heard some of those people saying that. I guess I would be in a position with all this, because I've read a lot of the stuff that has come out. I wouldn't know what to believe, frankly, in terms of the history. I mean, there's been so many different accounts of history from a lot of people that have a lot of letters after their name that, you don't really know, what has gone on. And that's part of the difficulty in all of this, is to try and judge, what actually was the case with respect to Mr. Dundas. And I still don't really know. I'm still kind of confused about that. And unfortunately, that matter's not in front of us today. That matter is going to come back at some other time down the road for those of us who are sent back here. So I look at it and say, which evidence are we shamefully disregarding? Because I'm not entirely sure whose evidence seems to be on all sides of this. And I think somehow we have to do a better job of sorting it out than we have done so far.
Yes, so I'm confused. I think we have to do a better job than we've done so far on these facts. So that is encouraging.
Great, come on. So where is it left with city council right now? What stage is it at?
The next step is for staff to come back with a recommendation for a new name. They have a committee that's working on that now. It's not public. Those are private meetings. And at the same time, they're supposed to be coming back with a recommendation a proposal for full compensation for the costs to businesses on Dundas Street. That all is going to be presented at the same time. Right now, the tentative schedule, I think, is first quarter of 2023. But if it follows the previous patterns, it will be the end of the second quarter, right before the break for the summer. So that's sort of what we're just kind of waiting for to happen next. I think it's kind of unfair that they're going to be dealing with the monetary side of this at the same time they're proposing the new name, because for sure the new name is going to be all over the headlines, and the sidebar story, if there is one, will be about, oh yeah, and they're proposing full compensation for business owners, but the details of that are going to be very critically important. Do the business owners have to pay for it first and then get reimbursed? What expenses will be considered reasonable? What will there be a ceiling on it? Will there be a time limit? Will they have 6 months, a year, 2 years to make these changes, change their name, get a new website, rebrand their business? All of those things. And if they were just allowed to make the changes and get reimbursed for what it would cost, our assessment is it would cost between $15 and $20 million for businesses to do that. And that figure, like that side of the expense, has never been examined. City staff have said 6 million, but that is only the city's expenses, and it isn't even complete. They have a very minimal budget for communications around all of these changes. These communications around such a massive change, not just to the street, but libraries, subway stations, a whole bunch of things. It's going to take a lot of money, and city budgets rarely come in under what was budgeted. Cost overruns are the norm. So the huge cost of this, my fear is that all of that is going to get buried when the next report comes out, because the real the sexy part of the story is going to be, what's the new name going to be?
So it's already been decided. I thought
No,
it hadn't been decided, but if they're looking for a name and they're getting reimbursements, they're going ahead with it.
They decided to move ahead with a recommendation to choose option 4, which is full renaming of everything named Dundas owned by the City of Toronto.
What about just revisiting that original decision? Certainly when that discussion at City Council about the process of renaming, that a lot of really good hits were made about the mistake of on Dundas, that he wasn't the person that they thought. And I thought that probably some of the people there, including the mayor, might have realized that they did make a mistake. What would be the process of getting the whole decision? Simply just saying the cost is going to be too gigantic, it's going to be too inconvenient, there are going to be too many risks with people not changing, their addresses on their driver's licenses and all of those inconveniences. What about just revisiting the whole decision?
Well, with some newly elected councillors who've never weighed in on it and haven't had the background information before, I think many of them would. It's likely that many would want to take a fresh look at this and have their own say. I also think now that the fever pitch emotion of 2.5 years ago has calmed down, that people are, and even those who supported the resolution initially, are going to be willing to take another look at it, because now, what they didn't know then is that the city has like an $850 million deficit. And they're going to be going to the province asking for money. Well, it's a little awkward, I think, to go to a conservative government asking for money when they're going to be spending possibly $15 to $25 million on city costs and business costs and residents to rename a street, while they've got homeless people and enormous housing problems. You know all this better than I do. But that's a hard thing to justify if you're going to be going to the province asking for money.
Oh, we have another question. We've got 2 questions. I think you had your hand up first.
I'm Max Allen. I know many of you here. Last night I was at Innis College to hear the 5 mayors, previous mayors of Toronto, talk about the strong mayor system that we may be visited with, and whether that was a good idea or not. The conversation among the 5 mayors and some questions from the audience was very civilized, as this was. And at the very end, John Sewell said, in response to a question by a student, the question was, what can young people do? John Sewell called for a riot. It's online. The hour and a half of the event are all online. And Sewell said, get 4 of your friends together, and the 5 of you go down to City Hall at a council meeting and shout until they pay attention to you. And if you can get 20 of your friends, go down to City Hall and shout even louder. And Mayor Crombie, former Mayor Crombie, was sitting next to him and said, astonishingly, I agree.
Oh.
Nobody tonight has suggested a riot. I don't know whether I'm going to suggest it in the long run or not, but it certainly ought to be considered. Look at what you've heard. You've heard a recitation of one failure after another to stop this bloody thing. Nothing has worked so far. Jennifer, I'm almost ready to join your parade on this and say, okay, let's keep going, because the narrative may be changeable. Your idea that we're dealing with a new council in the fall is smart. We are going to have some new people, and maybe one of those councilors will have enough support among their friends to press the pause button here and start over again, maybe. But maybe it's going to take a riot. I don't know. I don't think anybody can do anything except guess and hope here. But the fact that two of these things have happened at once, and there are, I counted, at one point there were 14 people in the room. This is a disgrace that there were 14 people here. There were 400 at Innis last night. But what to do in a situation where facts don't matter? And it's not that facts don't matter here. It's facts don't matter. Isn't this nice? Nobody has a device in their hand. Not even you, do you? But there are two of these blasted things open up here. I'm pointing to people who can't see me. I'm pointing to the laptops. That rascal, pretending to be a flat mechanical device, has made it so that anybody can say anything these days and get away with it. And this is a perfect example that we're dealing with here. Look up on the screen. What do you do in a situation where there's us old people grew up in a situation where civilized discourse included argument about what we used to call facts? Well, now it doesn't. Lynn mentioned, other people have too, that this is a case, both Ryerson and Dundas, a case of public hysteria. It doesn't matter what's true. What does? Sewell's suggestion last night was rioting.
You know, Max, there is another sequelae from these facts that concerns me, and that also arises out of my experience as a prosecutor. And it is what happens in the aftermath of a wrongful conviction.
Yeah.
Families of the victims are completely devastated. If they thought the trial was hard and going through all of that, imagine 10 years later, a conviction is set aside because DNA evidence proves that they got the wrong person. I really wonder how, like, teenagers right now who don't have much of a voice in this are going to feel in 10 years when they're living the reality of these kinds of decisions having been made, and they realize from their own independent study of these things that they got the wrong people. It's like, what a mess this generation is making of it right now. And how is it going to affect them? Is it going to make people feel disenfranchised and alienated from their society because it's so messed up? Is it going to motivate them to change it? I don't know. I just know that people who experience wrongful convictions in their own personal circle of family and friends don't recover from that. They feel a level of trauma from a wrongful conviction that is just a nightmare for them.
Well, some of them do, but look at the Moran case. When Guy Moran was convicted by one jury and acquitted by another, and eventually got to the point where the highest courts said these convictions won't stand, he never gave up, and neither did the people who were fighting for him. So there's an example of how never giving up works. But I don't think it comes with a guarantee.
Okay, your turn.
I didn't quite hear Mayor Tory's comment, was it summed up in, he was confused?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There, I just put up the transcript here.
Okay, oh, great, thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments? Okay, well, I'd like to thank both of our speakers today, and Carl and Edgar for putting this all together, and Austin for making all this equipment work. Thank you.